Many low-income, non-white communities experience law enforcement as an enemy instead of an entity of protection and service. Please look at this clip from the Hands Up, Don't Shoot campaign for an example.
Hands up! Hands up! Don't you move! Don't you move! I will shoot you! Hands up! Now! Drop the knife down! Shots fired! Shots fired! On the ground now! On the ground! Get back now!
Today's law enforcement guests will share their perspective on redemptive policing to heal the wounds. Please stay tuned. Welcome to Perspectives on Faith and Culture. I'm Reverend Dr. Karen Crozier, and today I'm joined by Chief of Police of Selma, Greg Gardner. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you, Doctor.
So as we saw the opening in dealing with the wounds and the estrangement that exists between non-white, low-income communities and law enforcement, we also have a particular perspective from Mr. Benjamin Wells in light of what the recent death of Freddie Gray. And the quote that comes from Mr. Benjamin Wells deals with the reality of Freddie Gray suffered death by accumulation of neglect, death by police culture, and death by bureaucracy. Please share your perspective on this particular understanding.
Well, in listening to that quote, what comes to mind to me is that I think what he's speaking about is he's referring to all the factors that came into place that had an impact on the decision that ended in the loss of life. All the different background, training, experiences, life experiences that had an impact or in one way, shape, or form formed the decision-making method that was used at that moment and ended up in the loss of a life. So in reference to some of the things that you mentioned specifically, the police culture, things like a general feeling of law enforcement as a whole, I think it's certainly something we have to explore because, if nothing else, because of what appears to be the frequency of situations like we're talking about today, that it would be certainly we would be derelict in our duty if we didn't spend some time, a great deal of time actually talking about where we are today and how we got there.
When you say explore, can you give some concrete examples what you mean by who is the we that needs to explore? Is it law enforcement taking responsibility and exploring law enforcement in relationship with decision makers, community? Please share more.
Actually, my response to your question would be yes. I think all of those groups, all of those individuals have to get together and discuss the situation we're currently in. I'll just speak from the law enforcement perspective, at least to start with. We have to and we should constantly examine the way we train, the way we prepare officers to do their jobs. And I think one of the things that we've been neglecting in terms of training has been the mental side of preparing to be a police officer. We have to take into account what's already there, what's in that package of that young man or woman who's decided to get into law enforcement, what's in that package before we receive that package and start training them. Part of what we need to do, I think, is try to develop a method of gauging what's in that package, what sort of pre-existing assumptions are already there when they get to the job. And once we determine what we find there, what we see, then I think we can have a better understanding of what we need to do from that point forward to try to either lessen the impact of those pre-existing thought patterns, or if they are if they are of a nature that would be conducive to good, positive, restorative police work, how to encourage the growth of those type of thought patterns.
So what particular, you're talking about thought patterns around perceptions of people groups, perceptions of what is crime, perceptions?
All of those things. I think the best way for me to describe it is a term that's been used quite a bit today in discussing the current condition of the law enforcement community relations, is that's implicit bias, where every human being, and it's certainly not exclusive to the law enforcement profession, every human being carries with them implicit bias. That is a predisposition to make a judgment based on all of the different stimulus that you've taken in your life, whether consciously or subconsciously, and that has subconsciously caused you to form an opinion of the circumstances around you. And I think what we're looking at now is that the effect of that subconscious pre-training, if you will, has to be looked at in terms of how that causes us to react to situations. One of the best ways that it was ever described to me was in relationship to air. A good friend of mine who is the director of the Museum of Intolerance in Los Angeles, she said, I've never been a smoker, but I guarantee that if you examined my lungs right now, they wouldn't be clear because of the environment that I've lived in. And that, I think that same analogy comes into play when we're talking about our mental positions in terms of how we formulate our opinions. We have taken in stimulus, we've taken in information, some of it incorrect, that have caused us to subconsciously make decisions based on information that isn't accurate. So I think we have to spend time examining how that occurs, examining what we can do to lessen that impact if that's a negative thing, and in some way, shape, or form infuse that into police training.
So share more back to this accumulation of neglect that was spoken of earlier within the situation of Freddie Wells and a police culture of neglect.
Right.
What would be some strategies or action steps that you perceive would be necessary in order to redeem or think differently or be differently as a culture of not neglect but of protection and service?
Well, it's always difficult to know exactly what he meant by that statement. I'll just tell you what I felt when I heard it is that the profession as a whole doesn't make it an absolute vital part of their everyday methodology in terms of connecting with the community. It's something that we do more of a matter of routine rather than a real concern. I think that just boils down to the human side of policing. One of the things that I do with my officers is I encourage them to make as many non-enforcement contacts with community members as they possibly can, meaning they're not contacting them based on a desire to enforce the law. They're contacting them based on a desire to create a relationship with them, to know them at a human level. And I think just like anything else, any other profession, any other relationship, once you get to know someone at a human level, you're less likely to make assumptions that may be incorrect because your information base is more accurate. You know more about them personally. And I think that's the neglect that he's referring to, is we've neglected non-enforcement contact. We're focusing only on enforcement contact. And I think we really, as a profession, have to look at methods of encouraging our officers to do the opposite, make non-enforcement contacts, and build personal, one-on-one, human-level relationships with the people that we serve.
Right, that reminds me, as a former early childhood educator, I was told to not only call the parents when their students were doing bad, but also call them when they are doing something good, worthy of affirmation and celebration for who they are, so that the parents would not feel jaded. So I sort of see a similar connection in the ways we educate and care for people.
Right,
policing.
Absolutely, in the sense that if the only contact that law enforcement officers, my officers, have are with people that are in the middle of doing something illegal, there's a natural tendency to drift towards thinking that everyone they come in contact with is doing something that they shouldn't. if you increase the number of contacts you have with people that are not doing anything that falls into those categories, your mindset balances out. At least in theory, it'll balance out to the point where when you do make a contact with someone, not knowing one way or the other what they're doing, your perception won't be skewed towards this is someone who's involved in misbehavior versus someone who might not be. And I think what happens is that the officers end up using the information that's happening right then, that's present right then, to make their decision, rather than basing on what may have happened or what they may have experienced in the past, and that clouds their judgment about the present. So
that's a whole lot.
It is.
Share about what was your interest and passion for law enforcement? What brought you there in light of the danger of the position, and what did you know about law enforcement before you got into it?
Well, me personally, I knew from a young age I wanted to do something that got me involved in people. I think personal relationships, and that's what I personally strive for. The more relationships I have, the more successful I feel I've become in terms of impacting other human beings. I even considered the priesthood when I was a young man, but it just didn't work out for me, in the sense that that was a pretty narrow focus. Law enforcement gave me, at least the impression was, it was a much more broad focus. I would be, once I got in the profession, dealing with every element of society at one time or another. So, and I knew I wanted to do something where I could help people, and this profession gave me a little bit of both. I can talk about my feelings, I can talk about my spirituality, my beliefs, and I can also help them with whatever is troubling them at that particular time, and try to get them back to a state of wholeness that they lost by one way, shape, or form. So
you've been able to serve in a function of priest, pastor, as law enforcement in your tenure there?
Yes, and it's really been a blessing for me over my 35 years in the business, is that I've had opportunities to function in a way similar to all those things, and I can think of no other profession other than what I do now that allows you to do that, and I will always be grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that. So.
When we come back from the break, we will share more about how we can look at institutional and cultural change beyond just mere individuals, and what that would entail from your perspective. We'll see you after the break.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today, or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Welcome back to the show. Today we are dealing with redemptive policing with guest Chief Greg Gardner. Before the break, we was talking about how you see your role not only as one who is enforcing the law, but also caring for people and the interpersonal communal relationships. What types of things need to happen in a cultural shift, especially in low-income, non-white communities with law enforcement, and knowing that you are positioned in Selma, which is predominantly Latino, Hispanic, low-income communities? Share, what is that like for you?
Well, I can tell you that my experience was quite different, coming from a large agency going to a much smaller agency in a city with a smaller population. Everyone knows everyone in Selma. There aren't any unfamiliar faces in a very short period of time. To get to specific to answer your question about the culture, what I saw had to happen in Selma, and it has to happen everywhere for that matter, is that in our profession, that sense of caring, to have a real concern for the people that you serve, has to be at the top. It has to start at the top, and it has to filter down through the entire organization. If it's not it being a value of caring for your community. If it's not a value at the top, it's not going to be something you can instill in the folks that work for you. So when I first got to Selma, I wanted to make sure that everyone there in my department and in the community understood that that was a very important value to me. I reached out through the people that I was working with and asked them to identify community leaders, specifically in the Hispanic community. And I brought them in and I talked to them, and I talked to them about my values. I talked to them about what was important to me, what my thoughts were about things like immigration and other things that were specifically of a concern to them. And I wanted them to get to know me as a human being, not as a police chief, because I think that is what makes the difference in terms of restoring that bond between the police and the community. If I'm just a person filling a position, then there's very little trust. But if I'm a human being that they know at that level, then the odds are that our trust level is going to be higher. It's not a guarantee, certainly. That's going to only be guaranteed depending on my actions. If I give them my word and I keep it, then they trust me. If I break it, then they won't. So, but it has to start with that personal relationship. They have to look me in the eye. I have to look them in the eye, and we have to understand ourselves at a human level. So that's what I chose to do when I first got to Selma. I knew there would be a concern. I'm not of Latino descent. Nearly 80% of my community is, so I knew that there might be some concern. Difference causes anxiety, and anxiety is something we have to deal with, otherwise it festers, so that's what I wanted to deal.
So what were some of the things that you heard the community leaders sharing, and how were you dealing with your own way of being vulnerable to them, and hearing them and being vulnerable as well?
Honestly, I was pleasantly surprised. They were very optimistic. They didn't come in with assumptions that because I wasn't of Latino descent, I would be less than caring about their concerns, and that was pleasing to me. I thought really that I may have to defend myself, but I didn't. They asked me what my thoughts were, and I gave them to them, and they were much like their own in terms of what was important to me as a human being, what was important to me as a police chief, the culture that I want to see our department live. They were happy to hear that, which made it rather easy for us to communicate. There wasn't a large disconnect. I was fearful because, as I said, I was an unknown. They didn't know who I was. They had heard about what I had done in my time in a larger agency, but that's just hearsay. They needed to see it in me. And one of the things that I've learned about a police-community relationship is it doesn't take long for the community to understand whether or not the person that they're speaking to is sincere or not. And hopefully, I feel at least they knew that I was, and that's what allowed us to work together as closely as we have.
So in light of your 35-year tenure in law enforcement and being in different agencies, a small city, a agency of much larger capacity, what has been some of your challenges in light of policing regarding the topic, especially in light of Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, even though Trayvon wasn't a law enforcement personnel, but someone who was assuming that. What has been some of your experiences in dealing with responding to incidents as such?
Well, there was a natural concern by all of our officers about what they perceived to be as an overall general sentiment of anger or displeasure with law enforcement as a whole. So we opened up dialogues. In fact, the first thing we did was we changed our vision and our mission statement. And the first thing our mission statement says is that we are a community-oriented police department. And I did that specifically not just so I can hang something on the wall and say this is what we did, but so we can start conversations about what that means. What does it mean to be involved in the community? And to this day, in fact, we just had a staff meeting yesterday, we were talking about how are we doing? Are we actually living what we say we are? Is this what we're doing? And one of the things we have to do in the profession as a whole is try to help understand the feelings of the community that may feel angry or disappointed or less than pleased with what they've seen in terms of the product of law enforcement. They have the right to feel that way. It's a natural feeling based on their experience with law enforcement. But also we have to have the understanding that that's changeable. and it's changeable if we want to invest the time and the energy and the spirit into changing that. You know, I'm often asked if I've ever experienced something like we've seen in some of the incidents personally, and I haven't in 35 years. I've never seen that, and it sometimes comes as a surprise to the people I talk to. It doesn't come as a surprise to me. Law enforcement officers make millions of contacts every day across the country, and 99% of them don't end up in a tragedy. But that 1% is what we're judged on, and we can debate for a while whether that's fair or not, but that's the fact of life. So I'm bolstered, my spirit is lifted by the fact that 99% of the time we're doing the right thing. But we can't ignore that 1%, because that's where the rubber meets the road for certainly some of the communities that have had a disproportionate amount of that 1%. So we've got a lot of work to do, and we're still going to do it. So.
Yes, you shared earlier about your faith and how it sort of connected to how you were able to integrate who you are with your faith and spirituality in law enforcement and policing. Can you share more about some of the tensions, such as being able to take somebody's life that may be contradictory or problematic for you, or is it not regarding your faith?
Well, thank the Lord, I've never had to face an opportunity where I had to take someone's life, but I believe in my heart that law enforcement officers should be there because they're called to be there. That it's the job that the Lord wants them to be doing. You know, at least that's the way I feel. What I've always known is that law enforcement, human beings, we can't solve our problems alone. I can't eliminate crime. I can't eliminate drug use, and it's just impossible. But there are other forces that can, and it would be silly for me not to at least try to tap into that force that is much more powerful, completely capable of changing the world. One of the things I did when I first got to Selma is I went straight to the Ministerial Alliance. I wanted to engage those people in helping me do what I do. In fact, just this morning at a meeting I was having, I shared with them what my desire is as a police chief. It is to, with that group and with their help, work my way right out of a job. I'd love to see a society where police aren't needed, where people take care of themselves. They don't need to police themselves. They don't have to be policed, I should say. They do it on their own, and I firmly believe we could get there. It might not be in my lifetime or yours, but that's my goal, and the only way to do that is to engage the faith-based community and put into belief my own beliefs about the power of God and how that can impact us on a broader scale.
So you're seeing your power, but also seeing the limitations of your power to trust in something bigger than you, if I've understood you correctly.
I can't imagine how desperate I would feel if I thought that I and my limited ability was all I had standing between me and chaos. I'm not capable of handling that, but I know that I'm not alone in that effort. So it really inspires me every day. I'm not going to fail because I'm not doing this on my own.
This next question has to do with women in the criminal justice system, how there's an increase of women. And I would like to point our attention to the stats for the viewers to see some stats on women from the Real Prison Project, and it reads that 79% of all women in New York State prisons are Black or Hispanic, and 2, nationwide, 1 out of every 109 women in America is incarcerated on parole or on probation. Share your perspective on what's happening with policing and women, even though in the media we see mostly Black males.
Well, I'd be curious to know what those statistics compare to in terms of the male population, and especially in terms of Latino and African American women in prison. I suspect they're going to be pretty close. I would guess that what we're seeing is something similar to what we're seeing with other non-white communities. There's a disproportionate number. I wouldn't even want to venture a guess as to why. I just know that, again, most of the anxiety that's created, most of the tensions that's created is because of differences. And I think we still, taking the race and moving it into a gender conversation, there's differences, and we need to talk about that. We need to figure out why, and how we're going to react to those differences. Will it change the way we think? Will it change the way we react? And the same implicit bias that I talked to you earlier in regard to race, there's implicit bias in regard to gender as well. And if we know that, we acknowledge that, how does that knowledge impact our decision making?
So in 30 seconds or less, as we close out, what would you want the viewing audience to walk away with in light of redemptive policing and who you are?
Well, I think what I'd like to say is, and I mentioned earlier how I'm trying to encourage my officers to make non-enforcement contacts with the public. I would like to encourage the public to make non-enforcement contacts with law enforcement. Reach out to them, talk to them, come to the station, come and talk to us, find out what we do and how we do it. Invite us to your community meetings. When you see us at a restaurant, come up and say hello. And it's a two-way street. And the more we have a human relationship, the better we're going to function. So.
Well, thank you for being on the show, Chief Gardner. Thank you for watching Perspectives on Faith and Culture. Take care, and God bless.